You have no idea what world you just walked into.
Then you picked the wrong woman to drag into it.
You bit one of my men. In my world, that costs something.
Then send me the bill.
The needle hit before she understood what was happening. 1 second, Chiara Donati was walking to her car in the parking garage beneath St. Vincent's Hospital, sneakers squeaking on wet concrete, lukewarm espresso in one hand, 14 hours of a double shift dragging at her bones. The next, a black SUV rolled up silent as oil. A door swung open. A hand closed around her wrist like a steel trap snapping shut. She didn't scream. She bit down, felt her teeth connect, tasted copper, heard a man grunt something vicious. Cagna. And then the needle slid in just below her collarbone, clean and deliberate, and the parking garage tilted sideways and her coffee cup hit the ground in a slow-motion explosion she didn't have time to watch. The last thing she saw before the world went black was a pair of eyes watching her from the back seat of the SUV.
Dark. Still.
Completely, without apology. The first thing she heard when she woke up was opera. Puccini.
Nessun dorma.
The kind of music that swelled like a fist opening in your chest. Chiara didn't open her eyes right away. 14 years of emergency nursing had trained her body to assess before it reacted.
Pulse. Pain.
Position. She ran the inventory fast, heartbeat elevated but steady, no restraints on her wrists, lying on something that felt obscenely expensive. No immediate pain except the dull throb below her collarbone where the needle had gone in. She opened her eyes. The ceiling above her was coffered mahogany. A chandelier hung at its center. Not crystal, but wrought iron, fashioned into something that looked like a crown of thorns. Amber light fell from it, warm as candlelight that had been trained to look expensive. She sat up. The room was large, furnished in a way that spoke of old money and older taste. A stone fireplace, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves with actual books, spines cracked, pages thumbed. Not decorative. A window with the curtains drawn, but she could see the edge of a garden through the gap. Dark outside. How long had she been out? Don't touch the curtains. She spun. He was sitting in a chair in the corner of the room. She hadn't noticed, because he was sitting so still he'd become part of the shadows, the way things do when they've learned how to disappear in plain sight. He was watching her with those same dark eyes, the ones from the parking garage. He held a glass of red wine by the stem, and he looked exactly like what he was. Dangerous. Refined. Absolutely certain that this room and everything in it, including her, belonged to him. Don't touch them, he said again. Not yet. Chiara swung her legs off the bed. I want to know where I am. You're safe. He said it the way someone states the weather. Factual. Mild. Not particularly interested in whether she believed it. That's not what I asked. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite respect, but close. Like she'd passed a small test she hadn't known she was taking. He set the wine glass down with deliberate precision and stood. He was tall. Not the kind of tall people commented on. The kind that filled space, made you suddenly aware that space was finite. Olive-skinned, dark-eyed, a jaw cut from something that didn't yield easily. Italian in the way that meant old, rooted, and completely sure of itself. My name is Dante Ferri, he said. And you're here because 3 days ago, you made a phone call to a detective named Harlan Voss. You're already holding your breath. I can tell. Because this isn't just a story about a woman who got taken. It's a story about a woman who refuses to become a victim, and a man who has never in his life met someone he couldn't read. Until now. Stay with me.
Subscribe.
Because what happens in the next 58 minutes will make you question everything you thought you knew about power, protection, and the terrifying line between. In that phone call, Dante continued, you've described a patient you treated at St. Vincent's. A man with a gunshot wound. Came in under a false name. Stayed 48 hours. Chiara's blood went cold. That man was my brother. She thought about lying. She was technically good at lying. Years of telling patients it's going to be okay when she didn't know if it was had honed that skill into something precise. She could keep her face still. She could breathe through the calculation. But Dante Ferri was already shaking his head slightly, as if he could read the calculation happening behind her eyes. The call was recorded, he said. We have it. We have the transcript. We have the detective's full name, his badge number, his home address, his daughter's school, and the coffee shop he stops at on Mulberry Street every morning. A pause. I'm telling you this so you understand the scope of what you stepped into. Not to threaten you. He let that land for one breath. Not yet. Not yet. 2 words that hit like a blade, finding the gap between ribs. Kiara forced herself to breathe. She was acutely aware, in a way she hadn't been through the shock of waking, of how completely out of place she looked in this room. Fair-skinned, dark-haired, still in her hospital scrubs, smelling faintly of antiseptic and shift fatigue. She was every inch the American woman who had wandered into something that had existed for generations before she was born and would exist long after. He came in with a bullet in his chest, she said. I'm a mandated reporter. I had a legal obligation. You had a choice, Dante said, cutting her off without raising his voice. You chose wrong. Now we're adjusting. From somewhere deep in the house came the sound of Italian. 2 male voices arguing, the kind of argument that had been running for years and would run for years more. A door slammed. Footsteps, unhurried. Then silence. Then the distant smell of the kitchen, garlic, tomatoes, wine. Something slow-cooked and rich. Dante moved to the door and paused with his hand on the frame. He was wearing a suit tailored to within a millimeter of his body.
Charcoal.
Notie. Top button open. His knuckles bore 3 healed-over scars, the kind you only got from connecting with someone's teeth. At the base of his throat, just visible above his collar, Roman numerals were tattooed in ink the color of old blood. 2/14/11. My family is having dinner in 1 hour, Dante said. You'll eat with us. I'll do no such. You'll eat with us, he repeated. Not louder, just slower. Which was somehow worse, because the alternative was eating alone in this room while they decided what to do with her without her input. I read your file, he said. That froze her. Bachelor of Science, Columbia. 14 years in emergency and critical care. 2 commendations from the hospital board. 1 formal complaint, Dr. Caruso's department, 2020, which you won. He didn't blink. You live alone. You have a younger brother in Phoenix you send money to every month on a nurse's salary. You haven't taken a vacation in 3 years. And you haven't been on a date in 8 months. The room felt several degrees colder. I like to know who I'm dealing with, Dante said simply. You had me investigated. I had you evaluated, he corrected, as if the distinction mattered. There's a difference. One is paranoia. The other is preparation. You'll want to wash your face, he said. First door on the right. He glanced back at her over his shoulder, and there was something in his expression that might have been in another life, in another man, something like consideration. Don't try the window. The drop is 40 feet. And I'd rather not begin this arrangement with your legs broken. He left. She stared at the door for exactly 4 seconds. Then she went to the window. 43 feet, if she was being precise. Stone terrace below. Garden beyond that. A wall she couldn't see the top of in the dark. She went to wash her face. The bathroom was marble. The soap smelled like cedar. The mirror showed her a woman she recognized. Same face, same jaw she'd inherited from her Calabrian grandmother, same dark eyes, but in a context so wrong it felt like looking at a photograph taken in someone else's life. She washed her face with cold water until her hands stopped trembling. Then she straightened her spine and went to dinner. The dining room was the size of her entire floor at St. Vincent's. The table sat 12, though only 6 places were set tonight. Candles down the center, real wax dripping onto silver holders. Cream plates with a gold crest along the rim. Portraits on the walls, oil-painted, severe, dark-eyed Italian men and women across generations, all wearing expressions that said they had never once been inconvenienced and had no plans to start. The men were already seated when a woman Chiara hadn't expected led her in. I'm Rosaria, the woman said. She was 70 at least, small and dense as an oak knot, dressed in black as if she'd never in her life considered another color. Olive-skinned, sharp dark eyes, white hair pulled back with a severity that was somehow elegant. She looked at Chiara the way a jeweler assessed a stone of uncertain provenance. Sit beside me. Don't speak until spoken to. Don't ask about business. Don't refuse food. I'm not. I know what you are, Rosaria said. Seat. There were 4 men at the table besides Dante. One in his late 50s, silver at his temples, flat hard eyes, compact and weathered and built like a man who'd spent his entire life being immovable. He sat at the head of the table. This was the Don. She understood that without needing to be told. The authority didn't radiate from his posture alone. It radiated from the absence of performance. He didn't need to demonstrate power because no one in the room had forgotten it for a single second. Dante sat to his left. The chair to the Don's right was conspicuously empty. Across from Dante sat 2 men who shared enough of his bone structure to be brothers. One older, perhaps 40, olive-skinned and harder-featured, watching her arrival with barely concealed hostility. One younger, mid-20s, the same Italian coloring but lighter energy, warm brown eyes tracking her arrival with something more like genuine curiosity. At the far end sat a man in a suit that was slightly less perfect than the others. Filed that away.
Rank. Dante Ferri, Dante said.
This is Chiara Donati, the nurse. Don Aldo looked at her. Just looked. It lasted perhaps 5 seconds. And in those 5 seconds, Chiara understood viscerally that this man had made life-and-death decisions about people across a table exactly like this one, and had gone on to eat his dinner afterward, without losing his appetite. Sit, said Don Aldo Ferri. She sat.
The food arrived.
Antipasto.
Bread.
Wine poured without asking. Then pasta. Rigatoni, thick with a ragu that smelled like something out of a memory she didn't have. Rich and impossibly good in the way that felt almost violent when you were also terrified. The older brother, she'd learn his name was Matteo, spoke first. Italian, rapid and cold, addressed to Dante. Though Chiara didn't speak the language, she understood every syllable of the tone. Why is she here? Why isn't she handled? Dante answered in English, slowly, deliberately, making sure she could follow every word. Because she's a witness, and she made a call, and the situation requires a solution that doesn't create more problems than it solves. A pause. And, because I said so, Matteo. The temperature in the room dropped. Don Aldo said nothing. He ate his pasta. His silence was a verdict. The younger brother, she'd learn his name was Enzo, looked across the table at Chiara with uncomplicated interest. Do you actually like nursing? He asked. Like, genuinely. Because that seems like a job you have to really want. And against every instinct she had, she almost laughed. Yes. Fascinating, Enzo said, as if she'd told him she summoned lightning. Enough, Matteo said. Enzo shrugged. He was the only person at this table who seemed completely unbothered, which either meant he was the safest person in the room or the most dangerous. She couldn't read him yet. Don Aldo set down his fork. Everyone went quiet. Miss Donati, he said, and his voice was the voice of a man who had never needed to repeat himself in his life. You made a call to a detective about a man who is a guest of this family. That call created complications. What I need, a handwritten note beneath it. This is not a gift. It is a test. She set it on the nightstand and stared at it. On the second evening, the door opened without a knock and Matteo walked in. Alone. That was the first wrong thing. In this house, men didn't move without purpose. Matteo had no reason to be standing in her doorway at 9 p.m. with that expression, the one that had contempt at its edges and something colder underneath. He was broader than Dante, harder in the face, same olive skin, but without any of Dante's controlled precision. Matteo's edges were rougher, held together by resentment. Matteo, she said, keeping her voice flat. I don't think you're supposed to be here. My brother's not here, he said. He closed the door behind him. And my father's asleep. Her pulse spiked. She didn't let it show. What do you want? You talk to a cop, he said, crossing the room. Not fast enough to read is threatening, but fast enough. And Dante wants to negotiate. That's the word he used. Negotiate. The contempt in his voice was a sharpened thing. My father's going soft. Dante's going soft. The answer to your problem is simple, and it doesn't involve you eating at our table. And yet here I am, she said, which means your father and your brother outrank you. That stopped him. It was the wrong thing to say. She knew it the second it left her mouth. She watched his face rearrange itself from contempt into something colder and more deliberate. He reached her in 3 steps and grabbed her arm above the elbow, not enough to bruise, enough to remind her that the equation in this room was not equal. You think because Dante finds you interesting you're safe? He said quietly. Women like you don't walk out of houses like this.
The phone was on the nightstand.
2 feet away. She grabbed it, hit the only contact, pressed it to her ear, and said loudly and clearly, "He's in my room right now." 3 seconds. The longest 3 seconds of her life. Then Dante's voice. First ring, already moving. She could hear it in the quality of his breathing. Already past a door. Already in a corridor. Where? My room. Your brother. She heard footsteps going fast. Then faster. The door opened. Dante stood in the doorway. And here was the thing about truly dangerous men. They didn't look dangerous when they arrived. They looked calm. Dante stood there and looked at Matteo with exactly the expression he'd worn at dinner. Controlled. Precise. Economical. "Let go of her arm," he said. Matteo dropped her arm. "Leave this room." Matteo left. Dante didn't look at her for a moment. He stood in the doorway, and she watched something happening behind his eyes. A calculation, a decision, something being sealed. Then he crossed the room and stood in front of her and looked at her arm where Matteo had held it. The marks were already fading. He didn't touch them. He looked at them, and she watched his jaw tighten once. "He won't do that again," Dante said. "How do you know?" "Because I'm going to have a conversation with him." A pause. "And in this family, when I have that kind of conversation, it doesn't need to happen twice."
"Thank you," she said. She hadn't planned to say it.
It came out anyway. He looked at her, and for just a fraction of a second, in the space between one breath and the next, something moved through his expression that wasn't calculation or control or assessment. Something older and rarer than any of that. Then it was gone. "You used the phone correctly," he said. "That's all." He left. She sat on the edge of the bed and listened to rapid, furious Italian from somewhere down the hall. She couldn't make out the words. She could hear everything else. By day 3, the rules had changed. Not announced, revealed, the way all rules in this world revealed themselves, through the presence or absence of obstacles. Guards who had been planted outside her door were now positioned at the exterior exits. The doors no longer locked. The windows still had a 40-foot drop. Don Aldo had not yet made his decision. She could feel the family waiting for it like pressure building before a storm. Dante had apparently decided his best intelligence on her would come from proximity. He found reasons to occupy the same space she did. The first morning of her expanded access, she found him in the library at 7 a.m., a cup of espresso and 4 open financial reports spread across the reading table. He glanced up when she entered, assessed her presence, and returned to the reports without a word. She took a book from the shelves, a biography of a former Secretary of State, something she'd never usually read, and sat on the opposite side of the room. Read it until the words stopped meaning anything because she was too aware of him working 12 feet away. At 9, without looking up, "You're not reading." "I am." "You've been on page 7 for 45 minutes. She put the book down. "What do you actually want from me?" He looked up properly. "Right now? Nothing. I'm working." "Then why am I here? What's the plan?" "Your father makes a decision, and either I go home or I don't. In the meantime, you observe me." "Why?" "Because understanding you," he said, with the same measured patience, "is the most useful thing I can do before my father decides. If I understand you, I can argue for the right outcome more effectively." She went very still. "You're arguing for me? Don't make it something it isn't." But she turned it over in her mind for the rest of the morning. Dante Ferri, heir to this family, a man who had grown up in blood and operated in shadow, was arguing for her survival inside a family council she couldn't attend. She didn't know what to do with that. Didn't know if it was kindness or strategy or something that existed in the space between those two things and didn't have a name yet. At noon, Rosaria appeared and told Dante he was needed. He gathered his reports, paused at the door. "There's a first aid kit in the second kitchen cabinet on the left," he said, not looking back. "In case you needed it for your arm." He was gone before she could answer. She went to the kitchen. The kit was exactly where he'd said. The mark from Matteo had already faded, but she stood there with the kit in her hands and felt, for the first time since the parking garage, something she hadn't expected to feel in this house.
Scene.
Enzo found her in the garden that afternoon. He dropped onto the stone bench beside her without ceremony, eating an apple he'd apparently brought for this express purpose. "My brother likes you. Your brother is managing a problem." "Sure," Enzo said easily. "But he also likes you." Those aren't mutually exclusive with Dante. Actually, they have to coexist. He's allergic to liking people who aren't also useful. It's a whole thing.
He took a bite.
"You're the first person in 3 years he's let sit in the library while he's working." She looked at him. He was younger than his brothers, lighter built, the same olive skin and dark hair, but with an ease in his body that gravity hadn't fully claimed. She didn't entirely trust that ease. "You're doing this on purpose," she said. "Doing what?" "Making me feel like I belong here. It's a technique." Enzo considered that, genuinely unbothered. "Maybe. Or maybe I'm just bored, and you're the most interesting thing that's happened in this house since Matteo broke 3 fingers on the gate in 2021 and refused to see a doctor for 5 days out of spite." He gestured vaguely. "You know what Dante does when he's not solving family problems? He reads. He runs 6 miles before the city wakes up. He sends money to 11 different charities under shell corporations, so nobody knows it's him. And he can cook. Don't tell Matteo. He makes this agnolotti that would make you cry. He hasn't cooked for anyone in 2 years." Enzo paused. "Since Valentina." "Who's Valentina?" Enzo's face went carefully neutral, which told her everything about how loaded the name was. "Someone he cared about," he said. He thought she chose him. She chose the FBI. She'd been placed in his life for 14 months. He found out on a Tuesday. He didn't eat for 4 days. Nobody said her name again.
Chiara sat with that.
"Who planted this garden?" she asked after a moment. The garden was extraordinary. Rosemary, lavender, basil, Italian herbs woven into formal planting like small acts of homesickness. Someone had tended this with genuine love. Enzo's face went somewhere private, soft in a way she hadn't seen it go. "My mother," he said. "She died when I was 8. But Concetta, the housekeeper, she keeps it exactly the way Mama left it. The empire, the blood oaths, the men with guns at every exit, and also a garden kept faithfully by a woman who loved the woman who planted it. A chair set at dinner for someone who would never sit in it again." "I'm sorry," Chiara said, "about your mother, and about Sarah." Enzo looked at her. "Dante told you about Sarah?" He did. Something moved through Enzo's expression, surprise, and then something more complicated. Something that looked almost like relief. "He doesn't tell people about Sarah. Ever." "I noticed." Enzo stood, looked down at her with an expression more serious than she'd expected from him. "For what it's worth," he said, "I'd like you to not get killed. I don't say that for everyone. I said it for the last stray cat Concetta brought in, but that's it." Almost a smile. That cat got to stay. He left her in the garden. She sat with the smell of rosemary rising around her and tried very hard to remember that this family had taken her from a parking garage with a needle and that the odds were still against her walking out under her own power. She tried very hard. It was getting harder. On day 4, she was in the library when she heard it. Multiple vehicles arriving. Not the usual quiet rotation of the family's cars. Multiple cars. Fast. Pulling up outside the compound in a way that put every guard in the house immediately on high alert. She heard the shift in the building's energy before she heard a word of explanation. Doors opening and closing quickly. Footsteps with purpose. Italian spoken rapid and low. She moved to the library door. A different guard outside it. Harder, more tense. He put a hand up.
Inside. Now.
She stepped back. He closed the door. She went to the window and looked through the gap in the drapes. 3 black cars in the driveway. Men climbing out she'd never seen before. Different cut to their clothes. Different way of standing. Italian, but the wrong Italian. Not this family's Italian. A rival family. Even she could read that much. Don Aldo came out to meet them on the steps, Matteo at his shoulder, face officially welcoming and functionally nothing of the sort. The rival family's head, a man in his 60s with a gray suit and a posture that carried its own warning, was speaking, expanding his space. Don Aldo was receiving without yielding. Then Dante came out, and she watched the rival man's attention shift entirely to him. Something passed between them. Recognition, assessment, the complex language of men who knew each other's capabilities and were simultaneously measuring and warning. She watched Dante's jaw. She'd learned it in 4 days. That jaw was the only place his composure slipped. And it was very, very tight. 20 minutes later, the cars left. Then Dante was in the library doorway. The Greco family, he said. Rivals. They've been under pressure from a federal investigation, sparked by your call to Voss. They're using that pressure as leverage to renegotiate territory agreements, in exchange for information that redirects the FBI toward us instead of them. Chiara's stomach dropped. My call started a federal investigation. Your call gave Voss enough to pull a file he'd been sitting on for 2 years. Which means you're not just a witness problem anymore. You're the origin point of a federal problem. The Grecos know that. He looked at her directly. They'll use you. Use me how? By letting the FBI know you're here. The room went very cold. If you're still here, you already know this isn't just a story. It's a descent into a world where love and violence speak the same language, where protection looks like possession and surrender feels like power. She came into this house as a liability. She's becoming something this man cannot categorize, cannot manage, and absolutely cannot afford. He's running out of ways to keep her safe without keeping her captive. She's running out of reasons to keep fighting him when fighting him is the only thing that still feels honest. Subscribe, because the people who stay for this kind of darkness already understand that the most dangerous thing you can ever do is fall for someone who is never supposed to let you leave. He came to the library at 11 that night. She hadn't been able to sleep. She was sitting in the dark reading by lamplight. The Secretary of State biography, page 7, still, when she heard his knock. The first time he'd ever knocked. She said nothing. He took that as permission and came in. He was no longer in a suit, dark trousers, shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows, top button open, and he looked for the first time since she'd been in this house tired. Not afraid. She didn't think he experienced fear the way other people did, but tired, the kind that lived past the body. He sat across from her. My father's decision is to release you. She waited. There was clearly more. Under conditions. You'll sign a document prepared by our attorney, a recantation of your call to Voss. Medical error, misidentification, shift fatigue. Your statement becomes, you were confused, you misidentified, you retract.
He paused.
And you'll stay here for 2 additional weeks. As assurance. Assurance of what? That you don't call Voss again the second you're out. And after 2 weeks, you go home, back to work, back to your life. She should have felt relief. She felt instead, strangely and inexplicably, like something was being taken from her that she hadn't known she had. She sat with that feeling and recognized it for what it was.
And did not say it.
Dante. First time she'd used his name without formality. He noticed. She watched him notice. What did you tell your father? He looked at his hands. A first. I told him you were useful. That releasing you under controlled conditions served the family better than the alternative. He paused. That's the strategy version. And the other version? Something in his face opened, fractionally, carefully, like a lock that had been turned only partway. I told him, he said slowly, that you are the only person I've encountered in years who looked at what I am and didn't flinch, and that there was value in keeping that close rather than eliminating it. He looked up. He found that argument inconclusive. Matteo's argument was simpler and initially more persuasive. I spent 4 hours making the case. 4 hours. For her. Why? She asked, and her voice was quieter than she'd meant. He looked at her with those dark eyes that gave so little away and had in 4 days given away more than he likely knew. Because it would have been wrong, he said. Simply. Flatly. Without decoration. The way a man says something he hasn't said in a very long time and finds it still fits in his mouth. Neither of them spoke for a while. The lamp burned. Somewhere in the house, a clock struck the half hour. Enzo told me about Valentina, she said. His expression didn't close. It did something more interesting. It accepted the wound quietly. He was trying to help, Dante said. He's always trying to help. It's his primary form of interference. A pause. Valentina was placed in my life to gather information. I found out on a Tuesday afternoon. His voice was even. His jaw was not. She was moved the same evening. 14 months, and there was never a single moment that was real. It recalibrated certain things for me, like trusting people, like believing that what I want for myself and what my life actually allows me to have are the same list. The silence after that was different. Heavier. Honest. Chiara looked at him. This dark-eyed Italian man in rolled-up shirt sleeves who ran a criminal empire and had tattooed his dead sister's death date on his throat and had, apparently, once upon a time, needed something real and been handed a perfect forgery. I'm sorry, she said. Not about what happened to you, about what it cost you afterward. He looked at her for a long moment. Then 2 more weeks. 2 more weeks, she confirmed. And then you go home. Yes. She held his gaze. Something patient and unnamed moved in the space between them. The betrayal came from inside the house. She was in the kitchen on day 6 when she heard Dante's phone call. She wasn't eavesdropping. She was in the adjacent corridor and his voice was raised, which it almost never was, and the Italian was coming fast and sharp, like something being cut rather than spoken. Then English. He always switched to English when he wanted to be precise. How long? He said. How long has she been reporting to them? A pause. Concetta. And Chiara understood. Concetta, the housekeeper. The woman who kept the garden exactly the way Dante's mother had left it. Who had brought Chiara tea at 11 the night before without being asked. Who had been in this house for over 20 years. She pressed herself against the wall and listened. She gave them the nurse's name, photograph, current location. His voice was terrifyingly quiet now. They have all of that. Find out who she's talking to at the Greco's, and bring me the contact information. Don't touch Concetta. I'll handle Concetta. He hung up. She gave herself 3 seconds. Then she turned the corner into the kitchen. He was standing at the counter with his phone in his hand, and an expression she'd never seen before. The expression of a man who has discovered that something structural, something as basic as the walls or the ground, is not what he believed it was. Betrayal layered over betrayal. How much of that did you hear? Enough. Then you understand that the Greco family now knows your name, your location, and the extent of your connection to this family. I understand that, which means they have leverage over us through you, and they'll use it within the next 24 hours. He set his phone down with that terrifying, deliberate precision. Whatever they demand, it won't matter, because your safety is no longer something I can guarantee inside this compound. You're saying I need to leave. I'm saying we need to move you tonight. Where? He looked at her. Something resolved in his face, and then, almost imperceptibly, he seemed surprised by his own answer. My apartment. In the city. It's off the family's books. Matteo doesn't know about it. It's the only location I have at the Greco's can't reach through Concetta. She stood in the kitchen of the compound where she'd been held for 6 days. The man who'd had her taken was now the only safe option she had left. I need 20 minutes, she said. And a better coat. The one I came in smells like the parking garage. Something moved through his face, not quite a smile. Close enough that she filed it away. 20 minutes, he said. The apartment was on the 21st floor of a building in the West Village. Marble lobby, silent elevator, a door with 3 separate locks he opened with practiced speed. Inside was not what she expected. No portraits of stern ancestors. No crests on the dinnerware. No guards in the corridors. This was an apartment lived in by a man with two contradictory lives, and this was the private one. Books stacked on every surface. A kitchen that was clearly and recently used. Running shoes by the door. A telescope on the balcony pointed at the city skyline. And on the kitchen counter, a single dying basil plant that someone had been trying very earnestly to keep alive and losing the battle. She looked at the basil plant. She looked at him. It came with the apartment, he said. It didn't. She could tell. He didn't argue further. She found the cabinet under the sink. Found potting soil in the cabinet above the refrigerator, which was exactly where she'd have kept it too, if she were someone who kept soil in kitchen cabinets, which she wasn't, but apparently he was. She repotted the basil in a larger container. He watched her from the doorway, said nothing for a long time. Then, "You don't have to do that." "I know," she said. They stayed in the apartment for 3 days. In those 3 days, she learned things about Dante Ferri that no amount of surveillance could have told anyone. He woke at 5:30, always, without an alarm. Made espresso with the focus other men gave to surgery. Read the news in 3 languages on his laptop. English, Italian, Spanish, and underline things in physical newspapers with a fountain pen like a man 30 years older than he was. Ran 6 miles at 6 a.m. and returned looking like the run had been a punishment he'd chosen for himself. Worked in silences that were total and somehow also loud. On the second night, he cooked agnolotti, fresh pasta. He made it himself, which she watched with undisguised fascination because the image of this man, who had almost certainly arranged violence against people who crossed his family, rolling pasta dough on his kitchen counter with flour dusting his forearms, was almost too much to process. "Where did you learn that?" "My mother." She sat on the kitchen counter and watched, and he let her watch, which was its own kind of intimacy. "Tell me something true," she said. "Something you've never said out loud." His hands slowed. "I would have left," he said. "Years ago. I had an acceptance to Georgetown law. I deferred the year Sarah died. Then the family needed me, and I deferred again, and eventually the deferment became a different kind of life." A pause. "I wanted to be a prosecutor." She absorbed that. The irony of that is not lost on me, he said quietly.
She almost laughed.
She did laugh, quietly, completely unguarded, and he looked at her. Something in his face opened. A window on a floor that was otherwise sealed. They ate at the kitchen table with the repotted basil between them. He poured wine. They talked for 3 hours about nothing to do with the family, the Grecos, the investigation, her brother in Phoenix, a book he'd read twice, the particular cruelty of ICU nights, whether the city looked better at 2 a.m. or 5 a.m., what it meant to be responsible for other people's lives. She went to sleep in the guest room that night with the city humming below her and the full, disorienting knowledge that somewhere between the parking garage and the basil plant, something had happened inside her chest that she had no clinical term for and no safe way to manage. On the 3rd morning, his phone went. He took it in the other room and came back 5 minutes later looking like a different person, or rather, looking like the person he usually was. The one she'd been allowed to forget for 3 days. "Mateo's been taken," he said. She stood immediately. "What?" "The Grecos. Last night, coming out of a restaurant in Midtown." His voice was controlled, but she could see what it cost him. "They have him." Mateo, who had come to her room in the dark, who had wanted her dead. He was still Dante's brother. The grip of that kind of love was not conditional on character. "What do they want?" Dante stopped. He looked at her. And in that look, she understood before he said it. "They want you," he said, "in exchange for Mateo. Your testimony. Your name on an affidavit. Full cooperation with the federal investigation, in exchange for Mateo's release and for leaving this family's operations alone while the Grecos rivals take the heat. Use me as a witness against your family." "Yes." She sat down, put her hands flat on the table because they needed somewhere to be. Looked at those hands, a nurse's hands, steady, that had held people through their worst moments, and thought about what they were being asked to do now. "If I say yes," she said. "If I cooperate, testify, give us everything, Mateo comes home. The Grecos leave you alone. And I walk away." "In theory," he said. The Greco theory of how this plays out for you is optimistic. In reality, you'd be a documented federal witness against an organized crime family, Chiara. Not this family, but in a world where these families have long memories, the optimism gets complicated. She looked up. And in your theory, what happens to you if I testify? If there's a documented witness and the investigation expands? He looked at her very level. I'm my father's heir and my family's primary legal and financial decision-maker. What do you think happens? The kitchen felt very small. The basil plant was between them on the table. You could give them Matteo yourself, she said quietly. If it came to that, save yourself. Something flashed across his face, brief and hot, gone before it fully arrived. He's my brother. He threatened me. He's still my brother. And she understood then, fully, without sentimentality, what this man was. Not a good man, not trying to be one, but a man with a code that was absolute and internal that he would pay any price to maintain. The code didn't make him safe. It made him real. He went to prep for the meeting. She stayed in the kitchen. She called Voss. It took everything she had. Her hands were steady because she'd trained them to be. She dialed the number she'd memorized, and he picked up on the second ring with a careful tone of a man who had been waiting for this call.
Donati, he said. Where are you?
Are you safe? I'm safe. I need a straight answer. If I came to you, full cooperation, testimony, everything, what's the protection situation? A silence. We'd have options. Voss. Her voice was quiet and final. Don't give me options. Give me the truth. A longer silence. Witsek would be on the table for a credible organized crime witness. But the timeline, the gap between cooperation and formal protection.
There's a gap, she said.
There's a gap, he confirmed. Chiara, if you're at the Ferris right now, I'm somewhere else. She paused. What I have from this week, it's more than a tattoo on a gunshot wound. It's structure, hierarchy,
Names.
compound location, a meeting between families. I know things. Then come in, Briggs said carefully.
Today. Now.
She looked at the basil plant. She thought about a dead sister whose date was inked on a throat like a wound that wouldn't scar. She thought about a law school acceptance, deferred until it became a different life. I need 2 days, she said. Then I'll decide. She hung up. She hadn't heard Dante come back. She turned from the kitchen counter, and he was in the doorway. Phone at his side. Expression the most unreadable she'd ever seen it, which meant she couldn't tell how much he'd heard. She didn't look away. He crossed the kitchen and stood in front of her. Not threatening. Not using any of the leverage his body or his world provided. Just stood in front of her and looked. How long have you been standing there? Long enough. Then you heard. Enough. His voice was even. You called Voss. Yes. From my apartment. Yes. The silence had weight and edges and something underneath it that wasn't anger, or wasn't only anger. You said you needed 2 days, he said. I did. Why 2 days? She looked at him. Because I haven't decided yet. He went completely still. What is there to decide? That's what the 2 days are for. Something cracked through the controlled surface of his face in a way that made her breath stop. Because she understood that this man, who had grown up with blood as a family business and power as a birthright, was standing in his own kitchen looking at her like someone who did not know what would happen next and found that unbearable and could not stop it.
Chiara.
Her name. Unguarded.
Just her name.
It hit her in the sternum like something physical.
His phone rang. He looked at it.
His face went hard. It's my father. He answered. She watched his face change with each passing second, watched something arrive in his expression that was beyond the flat hardness he usually wore. Something older and heavier. He hung up.
What?
Matteo, he said. The Grecos didn't wait for the meeting. He put his hand on the counter beside her, not touching her, just needing something solid. He's at St. Vincent's. They shot him. Chest.
St. Vincent's.
Her hospital. Her floor. How bad?
Lung.
He's in surgery. Who's the surgeon? Dr. Ferrante. He's good. If Mateo's in surgery, he has a chance. She was already moving, already thinking in clinical tracks. I can go in.
No.
I can get the actual surgical update. I know every corridor in that building. I know what the official line leaves out. She held his gaze. Voss might already be in there. Which is exactly why you're not going. Which is exactly why I am. She held him. I'm still a person who works there. I have a reason to be inside. You don't. If Voss is in there, I know what that means. A long look. Something moved through his face. The particular expression of a man who does not want to trust something and is doing it anyway and knows it and cannot stop. She opened the car door. Give me 45 minutes. She didn't wait for him to agree. She badged into the staff entrance with her old code. It still worked, and the building closed around her like something familiar and hers, and she had to stop in the stairwell for 3 full seconds with her hand on her chest. She smelled disinfectant and floor wax and recycled hospital air. She was in borrowed clothes over 2-day-old scrubs. She hadn't slept properly in a week. She was standing in a stairwell at midnight, having just crossed the city with a man whose family had put a needle in her arm 9 days ago. She breathed. She went up the stairs. Voss was waiting on the 2nd floor. She could see from his face that he'd been waiting specifically for her, which meant someone had tipped him. Conchetta.
Donati, he said.
Let's talk. She decided in that stairwell. If she was being precise, she decided in the moment when Dante had put his hand on the counter beside her and needed something solid, and the solid thing he'd reached for wasn't a weapon or a phone. Just the counter. Just something ordinary to hold on to. She sat with Voss in an empty consultation room on the 2nd floor. He had a recorder out. Off the record, she said. He put it away. Smart enough to know what that meant. I was in that compound for 6 days, she said. I can give you the location, the layout, names, and hierarchy. I can give you the Greco meeting. I have enough to frame a complete investigation. She looked at him. In exchange, the Ferri family is not the target. The Grecos have been feeding your department misleading information since at least 2019. I know that from 6 days in a house where people talked in front of me because they thought I was a problem to be solved before morning. The Grecos used your investigation as a weapon to destroy a competitor and redirected FBI attention deliberately. Voss stared at her.
Chiara.
Redirect toward the Grecos. I'll provide everything you need for a clean case. I need something on the Ferris. You have a gunshot wound patient in this hospital. Reported.
Documented.
My name already on it. She met his eyes. That's as far as it goes. Take it, or I walk out, and you have nothing. A long silence. You'd have made a hell of an attorney, Voss said finally. I'm a nurse, she said. We just have better instincts about when someone isn't going to survive. She got Mateo's surgical update from a colleague she trusted. Lung repair, clean margins. Barring complications, he'd be in recovery by morning. She texted it to Dante from a hospital phone and walked out into the night. He was parked in the same spot. She got in. Voss was there, he said. I know. He'd been tipped. She looked at his profile in the streetlight. Mateo's going to be fine. Dr. Ferrante got the lung. 2 hours to recovery.
He absorbed that.
His hands were on the steering wheel, looking straight ahead. What did you tell Voss? The minimum necessary to give him somewhere else to look. She turned to face him fully. The Grecos. He'll build the case toward them. Your family is the collateral that gets your brother's hospital room documented, and that's as far as it goes. A silence.
Chiara. Just her name again.
He looked at her. Why? She held his gaze. Because it was right. She meant it the same way he'd meant it. He looked at her for a long, long moment. Then he reached across the console and put his hand over hers. That was all.
No declaración.
No grand gesture. Just his hand, warm, olive-skinned, scarred at the knuckles, over hers. She turned her palm up. He threaded his fingers through hers. The next 48 hours moved fast and then settled. Don Aldo called a family council. Dante briefed her on it afterward, fully in detail, a new thing she understood. Not standard practice. A decision that cost him something with Mateo and the other men, but that he made without hesitation. The Greco contact information went to Voss through a secure method Dante arranged himself. Chiara found the irony efficient and said so. He almost smiled. Matteo came out of surgery clean. When Enzo called Chiara at 7 in the morning to gleefully relay that Matteo had asked from his recovery bed who had gotten his surgical update and had gone silent when he heard the answer, she decided that was the most she was going to get from Dante Ferri, and it was enough. Don Aldo received her one final time in the library. He was alone. He looked at her for a long time without speaking. She held his gaze, fair-skinned, dark-haired, in a borrowed coat, holding herself as still and straight as she knew how. "My son tells me you could have destroyed us," he said. "I could have. He tells me you chose differently. I did. Why?" She thought about the diplomatic version. Then she chose the direct and expensive truth. "Because I looked at this family and saw people who had paid enormous prices for things I didn't understand from the outside. And I thought compounding that wasn't the right move." She paused. "And because your son spent 4 hours arguing for my life in front of people who wanted a simpler solution. That seemed worth something." Don Aldo was quiet. Then he looked at Dante, who stood slightly behind her. Something passed between them. Old, wordless, decades of shared language. "Fear is a reasonable motivator," Don Aldo said finally. Conchetta was afraid. Someone she loved was being threatened. She made a choice.
He stood.
"I am releasing her from our employ. She will not be harmed." Chiara hadn't expected that. She looked at him. "Sometimes," Don Aldo said, "the person you don't kill turns out to be the most important person you ever meet." He walked out of the library. Chiara signed the recantation document. Medical error. Misidentification. Shift fatigue. She signed it and went home that night and stood in her own apartment for 5 minutes, just breathing the particular air of a space that belonged entirely to her, before she noticed how quiet it was. 3 weeks later, the FBI announced a series of raids on Greco family operations across 3 states. The news covered it for 2 days. Chiara watched it in the break room at St. Vincent's, eating a sandwich she'd been trying to finish for 40 minutes. Her phone buzzed. "Dante, are you watching the news?" She looked at the phone and smiled, in a way that her colleague Fatima noticed immediately from across the break room. "Chiara, I'm watching. 3 dots. Dante, making agnolotti. There's enough for 2. She stared at that. She thought about her shift ending at 7. She thought about a kitchen in the West Village with a repotted basil plant and a telescope on the balcony. She thought about a man who kept soil above the refrigerator and once wanted to be a prosecutor and had never quite lost the instinct to protect things he decided were worth protecting. "Chiara, I finish at 7. I don't like heavy wine on a weeknight. 3 dots. Dante, I have a Barbera. Lighter than you'd think." She put the phone in her pocket. "Who are you texting?" Fatima asked. Someone. Fatima repeated, deeply skeptical. Mara picked up her chart and moved toward the door. "A very complicated someone, who I'm figuring out. Should I be worried?" She stopped in the doorway, thought about it honestly, without flinching, looking at it straight. "Maybe," she said, "but I'm not." She took the train to the West Village at 7:15. Badged into a lobby she was starting to know. Rode a silent elevator to a floor she'd been on twice before. When the door opened, the apartment smelled like pasta and garlic and the particular warmth of a kitchen that had been used with care. The basil plant was on the counter. Healthy now. Green and extravagant. He turned when he heard the door. They looked at each other across the kitchen. "You're late," he said. 15 minutes. "I know. Traffic. You took the train." 14 minutes then. She set her bag down. "Do you need help?"
"No."
"Good," she said. "Because I'm a terrible cook." She sat on the kitchen counter in the same place she'd sat the first time he'd made pasta. And he talked while he worked, not about the raids, not about the family council, not about the chains of events still moving around them like water around stones. He talked about a book he'd finished, about what you could actually see from the balcony with the city's light pollution, about something Enzo had said at dinner that had made Don Aldo almost smile. She listened. "This is not the life I had before," she thought. "This is not a safe life. She thought, this is exactly the life I'm choosing. Outside, the city moved in its enormous, indifferent way. Inside, pasta bubbled. The basil grew. An Italian man who should have been a prosecutor and an American woman who had walked into something she should never have survived sat in a kitchen in the West Village and figured out, slowly, without a map, without clean answers, what came after everything burned. It wasn't safe. The Grecos were down but not gone. Don Aldo was watching. Matteo had not yet said her name. The FBI file would sit on a desk somewhere with her signature on a recantation and a detective who had filed his report with deliberate narrowness and would carry that narrowness like a splinter for years. None of it was over, but the pasta was good. The wine was lighter than she'd thought. And when Dante reached across the table later and turned her hand palm up and looked at it like he was reading something written there, she didn't pull away. She didn't pull away at all. If this story found you when you needed it, pass it on to someone who understands that some love stories are written in blood and sealed with sacrifice. If you've ever been caught between the monster you should fear and the man you can't stop wanting, you belong here. Subscribe so these stories keep finding the people who need them. And if you want to know more about these characters, if Matteo ever says thank you, if Enzo falls into something just as impossible, if Don Aldo ever tells anyone else what Sarah used to say, tell me in the comments. Because in this world, nothing is ever truly over. And the most dangerous chapter is always the one you didn't see coming.